In the previous part of our class, we talked about learner language. We also analyzed an example of how to make a correction on accuracy that was developed by Herbert Puchta. Let's watch another technique used by another teacher, and let us try to see what in principle is behind both techniques.
Muhammad Mehdi, what is he wearing?
He is wearing a brown shirt.
He is a brown shirt. Where? You please?
He is wearing.
Very good, thank you. Repeat after me. He is wearing a brown shirt.
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 Very good, excellent.
In the examples that we have watched, we realize that teachers are trying to correct aspects of grammar. Now, when we talk about the knowledge of the student, we need to bear in mind that there are two distinct types of knowledge that students build as part of their interlanguage system. The first one is the implicit procedural one, which is the set of linguistic items, the formulaic language that they will store in their long-term memories, that is, sequences of elements that are stored and accessed to as ready-made chunks, as lexicalized items, and the rule-based system, which is the unconscious knowledge of major and minor schemas consisting of abstract linguistic categories realizable in an indefinite number of sentences or utterances, that is, the grammar rules of the language. This is what we call implicit procedural knowledge. In both cases, teachers are working on the implicit procedural knowledge, that is, the knowledge of the system of the language, the rules of the language. But there are other aspects that are also part of this knowledge, linguistic knowledge that students develop, and this is the explicit declarative knowledge. Now, declarative knowledge consists of two distinct types of knowledge. The analyzed type, which is the conscious awareness of major and minor schemas, an awareness on how language works, and metalingual knowledge, which is the lexical knowledge of technical and non-technical linguistic terminology, right? How to describe an item in the linguistic structure. Now, we aim in our classes, we aim at developing both types of knowledge. The knowledge on how to use the language, and also the knowledge on what the language is like and how we describe it. In the examples provided, we note that the teachers are working with rule-based implicit procedural knowledge, and yet they are requesting students to become conscious on how these items work in the structure. So that would be as well explicit analyzed declarative knowledge. Now, in these two cases, we do not note any reference to the grammatical rule and a definition of the grammatical rule. In that particular case, if that was the case, there would be a metalingual explicit declarative knowledge development. Often, this is the case with children's classrooms. Teachers tend to work on implicit procedural knowledge and tend to use analyzed explicit declarative strategies, and they leave out metalingual explicit declarative knowledge. That is, they do not explain in depth with technical and non-technical items, non-technical words, the way in which the structure works, something that most teachers start doing on a steady basis as from secondary education. Yet, this doesn't mean that teachers do not work on explicit declarative knowledge. Much on the contrary, we do work on developing conscious awareness on how language works. So we are working on how language works as well as language. This is done for students to learn the language as well as to learn about the language. At this point, one wonders whether it's possible to anticipate the type of errors, the type of mistakes that students are likely to make in the process. And it is at this point that we need to turn into an explanation of the learner language, and this explanation needs to be done in terms of two historical approaches that had a great impact in language teaching. The first one is contrastive analysis. Contrastive analysis was developed by Pete Corder in 1967. Pete Corder explained that depending on the mother tongue of the student, some structures were likely to be problematic for the student if they were not in their mother tongue. Corder coined the term of transfer. That is, he said that when a student was learning a foreign or an additional language, they tended to transfer the structures of the mother tongue into the new language to be learned. So those syntactic structures that were present in the mother tongue would be naturally transferred into the second language. But he also anticipated that students were also likely to transfer those items that were not in the target language. So in that particular case, transfer would operate as a source of errors. From Corder's perspective, the teacher could anticipate the type of problems that students might have by comparing and contrasting the systems of the two languages in question, the mother tongue and the language to be learned, that is, the target language. Corder's theory was embraced by most educators of the time and helped explain many of the errors that students make when they are learning a language. In the following student productions, there are some mistakes that you would relate to the mother tongue, as is the case with Pelusa has got 10 years old to refer to age, quoting the Spanish form Pelusa tiene 10 años. Note as well that there are certain mistakes, such as the plural of fruit, fruits, that one would relate to the Spanish form frutas. But yet, there are some mistakes that you identify as common between the students. For example, she's dog, she's name. Note that this is not a transfer from Spanish, but what is it? This is where a contrastive analysis seems to be insufficient to explain the way in which learners build the language. And here comes then Selinker explaining from a different perspective what it is like to build up the interlanguage. In 1972, Selinker started talking about the interlanguage theory and referred to a set of distinct principles that are used by learners when they are learning the language. In his work, Selinker explained that learners use 5 main distinct learning strategies so as to acquire the language. The first strategy is false analogy. That is, learners overgeneralize and apply the set of rules that they know to most of what they learn next. This is the case, for example, of the plural. You say boy, boys, so the natural analogy is child, childs. The second strategy is misanalysis. That is, they use wrong assumptions, probably from the assumptions coming from the mother tongue, and they apply them to the new language that they are learning. This is the case, for example, of the genitive case that most learners tend to misanalyze as plurals. The third strategy is incomplete rule application. They tend to apply the rules in simpler ways, failing to recognize that there are sub-rules within the single rule that also need to be considered. This is the case, for example, of word order in English. Word order, subject, verb, needs to be inverted for questions, something that most students fail to do at the beginning of their learning. The fourth and very common learning strategy that students use is exploiting redundancy. That is, they tend to omit grammatical features that are not necessary so as to convey meaning. This is the case of the famous omission of third person s. The last strategy that we want to refer to here is that of overlooking co-occurrence restrictions, that is, not paying attention or recognizing collocational issues. So, a student would say quick food instead of fast food. Analyze these two student productions. What are the learning strategies that students are putting into play in order to write down their compositions?